Hello, and welcome to Week 2, Unit 5 of Application Development for SAP Business by Design. In this unit, we'll look at tracing and debugging. Now, as we write our code, it may not always work how we want it to be. And we also might just want to see what the logic is doing and make sure that it's working correctly. To do that, we can use tracing and debugging. They're ways that we can, at runtime, see what our code is doing and also step through it in real time. Now, tracing, first off, is basically a way that we can record information about our code. They're little statements that we put in our code that, when executed and tracing is turned on, will spit out information that we've told it to tell us at that point in time. It really is a really good way to be able to see what your code is doing and understand what it's doing without having to spend time debugging and provide you some quick information after executing a certain business process. In it, we can show static text and variables, so we may be able to say that this certain point of code has been hit, or that the value of this variable is XYZ. In this, we have the ability to print them out as information messages or error messages. They will never functionally change anything, whether we put info or error, so an error wouldn't necessarily stop our code from running, but it can be an indicator to us and to other developers what's actually happening at that point in time. Also, when we trace, we'll turn the tracing on, and it'll run, as we run through code, it'll print it out. Also, then when we debug, tracing is always turned on by default, so even in the debugger you'll see some tracing statements. And one thing to mention about tracing as well is, although this is extra lines of code, unless tracing and or debugging is turned on, it'll never execute those lines of code, so there's no kind of performance concern behind having trace statements within your code. The other side of this is debugging. Debugging is how we can see and step through our code in real time. So although tracing happens behind the scenes and printing out these statements we provided, debugging is a place where it'll actually stop where we tell it to, and then we'll have to provide some kind of action, our own input, to make the code continue on. So it allows us to stop our code in real time and see what are some certain values that are there. Is it executing as we go step by step through each line to see if it goes into a particular if statement or a loop. And so it's a really nice way that we can put in a breakpoint and at runtime step through and see what our code's doing line by line. It allows us, it's a really good way to locate any kind of errors you might have or to make sure that the data coming in is what you expect to see and that your code then executes properly. So between these two, we can work through our code and see what it's actually doing and make sure either that it's working right, or if it's not working right, what's the problem behind it. So let's go ahead and look in the studio and see how to do either of these. So I'm logged into the SAP Cloud Application Studio here with my development user, and I can see here my after modify event. I'm going to go ahead and put some code in here because this is a very easy place for me to test and see some tracing and debugging that's going on. First off, let's go ahead and add an info statement. So I'm going to use the keyword trace. Trace is kind of a special object that's there that allows us to trace. You can see it gave me the option of info or error. I'm going to say info for now, and I'm going to have the option of two inputs. For now, I'm just going to say this is the after modify, and then we'll also add an error statement. And let's go ahead and do this in our bonus rate here on the case of when bonus rate is less than 0. So I'll say trace again, but this time I'm going to say error. And I'm going to put two inputs here. First time I'm still going to put some static text. I'm going to say bonus rate is, add a space, and then I'm going to put a comma, and now I have the option to put a second string. Now, this expects strings, and obviously I could have different types of variables that are numbers or dates or an indicator like a Boolean value, but every single, anything that we have, we can always do a toString. So for example, this dot bonus rate dot, and if I say control space, you can see it gives me a round to string or a toString function. I didn't have to implement these. They're part of the framework that's in place. I'm just going to go ahead and say toString and then close this off. So it's going to take that number, the bonus rate number, and actually translate it into a string, which will allow us to put it in the trace statement and execute it. Let's go ahead and save and activate that. Now I can run these tracing and debugging sessions either for really any user, whether it's this user itself or another user. And since I want to test with a business user, I'm going to go ahead and tell it to do that. I'm going to go up to Administration and go to Options and Settings. In here, I'm in the SAP General tab. We already worked with the connectivity, but I'm going to go ahead and go to the second to last one, Debugging and Tracing. Now in here, I can maintain what user I want this to debug for or not. If I leave this checkbox unchecked, that means it's going to debug for my user, the user that I'm logged into the studio with. If I want to provide a different user, I can select this checkbox and give it a name. So I'm going to put in sales 01P, 01P actually, and say OK. And you can see here I'm going to log in with this user as well, sales01P. And first let's go ahead and log in with the user directly. Let's say welcome. Make sure the password's right. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my work center. Now what I'm going to do is once I get this user, this user does not have access. I'm going to go ahead and log off and we'll change users actually. We'll put it back to sales02P, which will have access. Let me go ahead and update my settings here. Great. Now this user has access to my bonus plan. Now I'm going to first get for tracing, I'm just going to go ahead and go directly to a bonus plan and get right about to the point where I'm going to execute this code where I put my trace statements, which for us is our after modify. So I have a bonus plan open. In the studio, I'm going to go ahead and hit this record button. If I don't have this, I can always add it either through the view and be able to pull up my Trace Explorer and other details, or I can make sure that if I right click, you can always manage your toolbar from here and select what you want. So I have the debugging toolbar. I'm going to go ahead and hit this little record button, the red circle, and it tells me that it's running the trace, so that's great. We'll say OK. Now I'm going to go ahead and execute the after modify and make sure that I have a negative rate. Let's go ahead and say OK. So now I've put in a negative rate, I triggered a modification. Let's go back to the studio and hit the stop button. So now a trace has actually occurred and we want to see what the output was. Now there's a little kind of movie clacker icon here, which is our Trace Explorer, and if I open that up, you can see that a trace was actually completed for that user. And if I select this and again open this, it tells me, okay, there was at least an error that happened in the after modify. Let's open this up here. And so it should have already hit our info statement. And if you see here, there's some other information that tells me what's the general ID of the object. You can see it gets a retrieve for another object, which is our employee through the association. So it's telling us some general info about the object itself, but more importantly, you can see there's this user-defined trace command. Let's go ahead and open that a little bit and open the name field. So you can see that this is the after modify, which is the statement I first put in, the info statement, shows that it's information. And then remember, we put in our trace error statement here, and that is number 3. So again, a user-defined trace command, and this time it says bonus rate is, and then shows me -10, which is the value we entered. So that's correct. That's what I want to be seeing, and that means that my trace is executing. So now I could have a number of trace statements in my code, depending on where I want to look and react to these, and then be able to run the trace. I could tell another user I have the trace on, go ahead and run through your scenario of whatever issue you're testing and seeing, and then I can come back and look what actually happened, what was the values, and be able to then adjust my code or data accordingly. So this is tracing. Now I'm going to do something similar for debugging. Let me go ahead and close these out, and we'll shrink this back down. Now, as I put that in the administration, when I said enable trace and debugging for this specific user, not only would it work for tracing, but of course debugging. So now I can also run the same thing with this user using our debugger. So I can set breakpoints within my script files by just hitting this little gray bar, and it'll show a little red dot. That means I now have a breakpoint in place, and that's what these are, breakpoints. And this is where the debugger is going to know where to stop. This time I'm going to hit the little green arrow, the start debugging. It's going to tell me that it's debugging for this user, and then I can now ask this user to log in and test. So I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh here, and I want this to refresh. It should show this user that there's some tracing or debugging going on. Sales 02P. And I'll go through and run through the scenario again. Now this time it should actually stop on my code. So let's go ahead and put in -10 again. Let's close this. -10. And I'm going to hit enter. And now my debugger should stop. And I can see again, here's the trace mode. It shows me that it's currently active. And here my debugger pops up. It tells me that it's in the after modify method. I can see the code. And so here's what where my code is. This little yellow line tells me where I'm currently executing, or what line is being executed. Also, I can see some info down here about the actual object, some values of different variables. So this, remember, is always the particular node of that business object that we're in that's being executed for the script file, which in our case is the root of our bonus plan. So I can see info about this object, all the variables that are there. Notice how I can't get down to any subnodes or associations. So we have an employee association, but it doesn't actually show me that here. So the debugger will only show you info relevant to that particular node. If I want to see something else, let's say some other data from the employee, the name, for example, I would have to either put it in a trace statement or bring it into a local variable in here in this action or event to be able to see that data, because after that, the local variables will also be displayed here. But now I can step through my code, and you'll see there's also some other buttons up here to allow me to work with my code to show the next statement, step through, step out. Typically, only place you're going to use step out is if you're using a reuse library, because after I step out of my events and actions, I'm just going into framework code, which I can never see or touch or do anything with. So I'm just going to step over for now, and it's going to run a couple of these lines. So we ran through this dot is consistent is equal to true, so we can see it set it to true. It set up a trace info, and you see here on the right hand side the output of the debugger shows that trace info as well. So like I said, tracing is on by default for any debugging. And I can continue to go through and step through all of my logic here, any loops, if statements, etc., and see what the variable names are. I can't change anything directly, so I won't be able to change a value within the debugger, but I can at least see it. And then if I catch a problem, I can always go back, change my code, and be able to adjust it as I need to. And once I'm done, I can either just hit stop if I want to completely stop debugging, or continue on if I want to finish to allow that particular event or action to occur and keep the debugger on. So that's how we can debug and trace within the studio. Gives us a great way to be able to see what our code's doing, to be able to work with it, adjust it as we need to, maybe see if there's a problem actually with data. That's a very common issue that could occur. It might just be, especially in a test system, that you have some funky data and it's not actually your code that's having a problem. And debugging is a great way to be able to catch that, or even tracing. So this is tracing and debugging. That ends it for week 2. In week 3, we'll be looking into UI, or user interface, and extensibility. So thank you very much.